Thank you for your invitation. In this talk, I would like to talk about five and a half different matters which impact pension matters. So, the first one I'm going to talk about is coverage issue, which applies with equal force to both contributory or non-contributory system. Then I'm going to talk about informal work, what exactly happens and how it actually plays out. I will talk about density of contribution. It's a fairly easy topic. There is also a political angle that we academics often either ignore or fail to take into account in our discussion regarding pension. Then I'm going to talk about the last bit of what happens when you actually have a contributive pension system, where you get a payout in the form of typically an annuity, a contingent annuity, over a period of time, and what's happening in that space. Finally, I'm going to talk a little bit about corporate governance, and that will touch upon things like what happens when you have cases of questionable transactions by the pension funds. So let me start right at the top. We go all the way back to Bismarck. As every school child knows, that Bismarck was the architect of the pension system. It started out as a non-contributory pension system. Later on, it became part of a pay-as-you-go system as we know it today. And that was really the start of it. There were other attempts over history of mankind, but that was really where the state came into play in offering pension to masses of population. Essentially, what Bismarck said was that we need to have this system in order to reduce poverty among the aged population. That was his primary goal. And he said that in many forums, and he also wrote that in his memoir, wrote that in the letters he wrote to his friends. Here's the curious thing. He set the age of retirement at that time in 1886, 1881 I should say, to 70. What proportion of German population reached age 70 at that time? The answer is 0.1%. Which meant that you have to be really, really old, and the money that was given out to you only given out to a very tiny proportion of the population. Only in 1916 it was lowered to 65 as we know it today worldwide. So, what was the purpose of the Iron Chancellor's proposal? And he wrote that to his friends. We know that from the record. He said, I really want to stop a revolution. If people see that old people are dying in the street, that is very, very bad for the government. So it was not that he was being socially welfare-minded, as most people tend to interpret his actions today, but it was very, very different. And if we look at the coverage of developed countries, we see the following pattern. We see in a period of time when Social Security was introduced, around the same time, the economies start rapidly formalizing, meaning that people get bank accounts, they have other kinds of formal jobs, etc., etc. And that's how it occurs. To give you an example, let's look at the US in the 1930s when this whole thing started there. So, coverage of civilian population, 1932, it's 0, and then it goes on increasing. And by the time you get to 1950s, you essentially have more than 80% of the population covered. By 1964, it's over 90%. And it's been increasing ever since, but fairly slowly. So, the vast majority of the population is already covered within first 20-30 years of the existence of the system. And this pattern repeats across the globe, but for the developed countries. However, what happens in developing countries? Does the same thing happen? The answer, unfortunately, is no. So I'm going to talk about two specific countries, India and Mexico, of which I know a little bit. So here is what happens with the Indian informal sector, India's informal sector. So in the 1980s, the informal sector accounted for about 91% of the population. In other words, formal economy really constituted of 9% of the population. And if you're in the informal economy, it's very unlikely that you get any kind of pension whatsoever. Fast forward that down to 2004 and 2005, you see the big jump in the reduction in the informal economy? Neither can I, because it didn't happen. And that's the problem with the pension system as exists in India. The informality has not gone down. As a result, pension system as we know it, either pay as you go or the contributory kind, basically does not exist for very vast majority of the population. Here's the coverage in Mexico. This is coverage here. I take it as to mean the population, the number of workers covered divided by the economic active population. And that number, starting in 1944 when the system started, it went up. And it went up to, if you go to the top of the picture, right there is where the peak occurs. So by the 1980s, which is 40 odd years, you have 30% of the population covered. And then it stops. And this is exactly the same kind of pattern that we see across the globe in all developing countries. In other words, the pattern that we saw for developed countries has not repeated for developing countries. We do not get anywhere near close to universal coverage of Social Security at all. And this is a problem because essentially if you're not in the formal sector, you don't get anything from Social Security. However, when I say Social Security, I mean, retirement benefits and that sort of thing, not necessarily other stuff. For example, here is a graph of healthcare coverage in different countries. On the top of the line, you get the standard European countries, Austria, France, Germany, where the system started back in the 1920s, and then it slowly went up and covered pretty much 100% of the population. But look at what's happening with the developing countries. They started from zero, practically zero, in 60s, 70s, or in 2000s, but then it grew rapidly. So healthcare coverage is very different from pension coverage, as we can see from this graph. Why is that happening? Well, I do not have an answer to that question, and if any of you do, well, please let me know. Contributive pension. As I said earlier, it's obvious to see why for contributive pension, informality in the economy is a big problem. And essentially that's what has been pushed by the World Bank in its document 1994, and it's been pushed into various countries, developing countries, and most of the thrust of that stuff has been largely on contributory systems. And the flip side of that, of course, is the informal sector gets nothing. Suppose if Mexico started the plan, it started with the 65 más, now it's 60 más, and that increases. Mexico wants to increase the coverage to everybody in all states at the same level. Let's say to one minimum salary. We've done some calculation on that, and it will increase the cost of 60 más by a factor of 10. So any kind of introduction of universality across the population is not going to come cheap. The problem with informality is that it's not static, meaning that people jump from informal to formal and vice versa at a fairly good clip. So every year, for example, about 20% of the formal sector goes into informal or vice versa. So there is a large movement of people moving from one to the other, and that makes it rather fluid as to the business about formality or informality. And that's a problem, because the moment you go from formal to informal, you stop contributing to the contributory pension system for obvious reasons. And the other problem that most people do not talk about is what I call the part informality. What is part informality? Part informality means the following. You are in the formal system only part of your salary. So imagine if you have if you earn 3 times the minimum salary, to the IMSS you declare only 1 minimum salary as your income. So that's your formal income. The other 2 minimum salary you get from the company under the table. What's the advantage for that, for the people to do it that way? Well, they avoid paying any taxes and they get all the benefits because you are already registered with IMSS. And how do we know that's happening? Well, a few years ago we did some data analysis with the affiliates of IMSS and contrasted that with survey that's done by the household survey. And these are log scale income. That's why you see it's fairly symmetric, but really it's really skewed to the right. Okay, so what happens with that? If you look at the wages reported by IMSS, the income, the middle of the income sits right around there and not much of a right tail. However, when you look at the survey data, you see there's a lot of people earning a lot more. So what exactly is happening here? These are any people who declare that they work in the formal sector and therefore they are comparable. Clearly, there's a lot of underreporting going on by the workers, especially in small firms, as they report them to IMSS. And that's a problem. Again, we do not see much of this in the literature. There's a paper by some of you guys that shows that the existence of Seguro Popular has actually stalled the formalization process. I'm going to come back to that in a second. Third is the density of contribution. So density of contribution depends on a lot of things. For example, when you think about women in the labor force, they are working, but motherhood typically interrupts their time in labor force, and therefore they get a hole in their income stream. And that's very, very, very common. Second, there is unemployment. If you're unemployed, obviously you're not contributing, and that's something that depends on macroeconomic factors. The business about formal versus informal, if you can jump between the two, that's affected by taxes, income taxes, and that's by also by how much cost you tack on firms in the formal sector to actually employ somebody. And that can vary from 10% to 50%, for example. And then you have people in and out of labor force as a result, and implication is, of course, if you have higher density, you have higher pension. If we look at the particular case of Mexico, this is what the Afore density looks like. It has a U-shaped distribution. There's a whole bunch of people who are contributing very little. There's a bunch of people who are contributing a lot of the times, and in between. And this is the same for almost all the developing countries. This is the same pattern repeated over and over again. Of course, the exact numbers are distinct, but the pattern stays exactly the same. Let me come back to the question of the Seguro Popular. So Seguro Popular was introduced in early 2000s, and then the rollout happened to have a time frame of up to 2010, where it was supposed to go up to 100% by 2010, which actually didn't happen, but that we could have seen back in 2005 when we were writing this paper. We showed that this is not a realistic goal, and it didn't work out that way. The Bosch and Campos study showed that introduction of this system of Seguro Popular actually worked as a disincentive for people to join the formal sector. There was also another political side of it that most people do not talk about, and that's the following. When Seguro Popular was rolled out, obviously these things don't happen in vacuum, it happens under a political system. And so exactly how did the rollout happen? When you got, most countries, most of the country does not have coverage, you roll them out slowly across the country. Do you do that in a randomized fashion? Well, if you do it neutrally, that's what you would do. But here is what happened. Between 2005 and 2006, when the election mode was in full swing in Mexico, it became very clear that the left-wing candidate López Obrador was actually leading in most of the surveys. And what the government did was to roll out the Seguro Popular into territory where the candidate for PAN, Calderón, was trailing. And that was possible because the party actually was in power. So they actually did that. How do we know that they did that? That's indirect evidence here, which shows that beneficiaries of the Seguro Popular voted twice as much for Calderón than for López Obrador. And to me, that's a fairly straightforward inference to say there was a problem. And if you look at the non-beneficiary, that's the counterfactual, non-beneficiary of Seguro Popular, the vote was evenly spread. So did it make a difference? If we look at the vote difference in total nationwide between Calderón and López Obrador, the difference was less than 250,000 out of a 40 million vote cast. So it certainly made a difference as to who became the next president. Let me talk a little bit about the the business about what happens when the accumulation phase goes off and you get into the phase of when the money is actually distributed. So what does an individual get from the Afore or what have you as your contributory pension scheme? Well, typically you get a stream of income which lasts for the rest of your life. So essentially you get a contingent annuity, contingent on you live. It may be a two-person contingent annuity. You and your spouse can be both factored in. But most of the systems that we have in Latin America are focused on the individual rather than the couple. Anyway, that's another point. So what happened over time is the following. If you go back to, let's say you put in $100 or 100 pesos in that fund. What do you get? And let's say you retire at age 65. What do you get as a steady stream of income for the rest of your life? And this is without taking into account the inflation and so on. That adds another factor to this. But anyway, what has happened if you were to retire, say, in 1981? These are data from the United Kingdom, for which we have a much longer time series from 1957. What you would get if you had retired in 1981 is 16 cents on the dollar for every dollar you actually put in your fund. 16%. And that lasts for the rest of your life. Okay? 1981. Fast forward to 2015, you put same $100 in the same fund, that will offer you only $4 per year. Which means that the annuities have been paying less and less and less and less. And this is a big problem that has cropped up in the last 3 decades. Will this thing continue? If the secular stagnation hypothesis is correct, as has been proposed by several prominent economists for various reasons, then this is really going to be a problem when these guys actually retire in large numbers in the future. Lastly, let me talk about corporate governance, mostly about fraud and related things. What happens in developing countries is that when you introduce these big pension funds who manage a large chunk of the total investment quantum in the country, they can move the market, and they do. As a result, they can be liable to do all sorts of things in the market that are not desirable. So here is just a small example of that. The news came out on the 12th of March 2018. The Reuters reported that Pensioniste, which manages about 195 billion pesos, $10 billion, mostly in government workers' retirement money, because of the large shareholding in ICA. ICA is one of the construction companies where they sunk in a large amount of money. They became a largest shareholder of that company. And what happened to ICA subsequently? It went bankrupt. So the question is, should the country's pension funds be allowed to invest in these kinds of things? Well, ICA says, the pensionista says, ICA was a good company and we invested in that when it was good. Well, it went bad later on. That's not our fault. However, there's a lot of lingering questions as to when these purchases were made. On the surface of it, it looks like much of that purchase was done after ICA actually was in trouble. And since by law there is some requirement that you cannot invest in a pension fund unless it has MX AAA minus rating or above, it's really, we need to get to the bottom of this to figure out whether there was any wrongdoing or not. But on the face of it, it looks like a standard deal. With that, I will conclude my talk. Thank you very much.